Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this GTWN CMS Technology, Sovereignty, and Realpolitik webinar with featured keynote speaker, Dr. Hermann Hauser, expert commentation by Vrinda Kapoor, and being moderated by Dora Petrani, co-head of CMS TMT Global Services, and myself, Candace Johnson, founding president of the GTWN. Just this morning, I opened up CNBC and read NASDAQ's worst session. The NASDAQ Composite suffered its worst session since December 2022, plunging nearly 3% as semiconductors came under pressure amid reports of tougher trade restrictions. The S&P 500 also retreated as the rotation out of technology stocks continued. 5 years ago, Dr. Hermann Hauser wrote in a very keynote, groundbreaking statement, in an ideal world, every major region would be able to manufacture and access critical technology, assuring healthy competition and trade by worldwide standards that won't allow withholding with technology without a reciprocal effect, without any single regions having a monopoly. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Hermann Hauser. He will be talking also about the fact that technology sovereignty has become a dominant issue for this decade. A country that answers no to the questions, are they producing the technologies it needs, or do they have them guaranteed, unfettered, and long-term access to them? If they answer no, then they are vulnerable to technological coercion. Dr. Hauser, we are delighted to welcome you. You have so many accolades to add to your name, be it the co-founder of ARM, be it the co-founder of Amadeus Capital Partners, be it having helped numerous startups around the world. Over to you, dear friend.
Thank you very much, Candice, for this kind introduction. Candice asked me to be controversial, so I hope you can see my screen now. I hope the screen works.
It does indeed, Hermann. And as I told you before, you have to be careful what you ask for because you might get it.
Right. So that's why I chose the title of my talk, which is the Technology Sovereignty Delusion. So let's start off with the presentation, with the present situation. And it was a bit worrying that the big tech sell-off that should have happened or did happen, half a year ago, and a possible recession seems to be happening again today. Of course, we've recently had a big IPO of one of my companies called ARM at 55 billion, which at the time reinvigorated the tech stock market, and the ARM is now valued at more than 150 billion. So since then, in less than a year, it has created over $100 billion of revenue for SoftBank, which is still the majority shareholder. So against this sort of difficult situation for Europe in particular, there is some good news that for the first time in history, European venture capital gives better return than US venture capital. That hasn't happened before, but has an easy explanation, which is that the output of European universities is comparable to American universities, but we only have a quarter of the venture capital chasing that, substantial output. So it's not surprising that the returns are better because the valuations are lower. It's also worth saying that now is the best time to start a company. And I'll be talking a little bit about the European Innovation Council, which I helped to set up, which is the world's largest deep tech fund at 10 billion. And the European tech culture has matured enormously. And there are a few key technologies like AI, of course, that is in the news all the time, blockchain, smart contracts, quantum computers, where I spend a lot of my time because I'm a physicist, and it's just delightful to see quantum computers appearing. But long term, I think that synthetic biology will be the most important new technology for us as human beings. But against this background, technology sovereignty has really become the iconic issue of the era. So what is technology sovereignty, and how should we define it? Well, it was really unfettered access to all the critical technologies that we need to govern a country and allow an independent economy to appear. And of course, examples are computers, the semiconductor industry, networking, 5G in particular. I mean, if you took smartphones away from young people, I don't think they would call life worth living. AI and machine learning, and then synthetic biology. In Europe in particular, we've had two wake-up calls with respect to technology sovereignty. One was we realized that we couldn't even produce masks and personal protection equipment during COVID. So it just brought it home how dependent we are on China for manufacturing. We also saw in the last Trump era, and this might repeat itself, of course, if Trump becomes president again, he weaponized US technology, and by withholding some of the key technologies that the US dominates, he can coerce other countries to do what he wants. In this particular case, he forced ARM, a UK company, to do what he wanted. And this is one of the reasons why I started writing this book on technology sovereignty, because I felt that it shouldn't be up to the president of the United States to tell a British company what to do. If the British government says that, and since it is a government of a sovereign nation, that's fine. But for a foreign person in the White House to do this, I felt was an unfair arrangement of our planetary governance structure. So it became clear to me, and of course everybody else, that economic coercion of this kind can be as effective as military coercion of yesteryear. And therefore we need 100 billion technology fund in Europe to give us our own independence. And it really raised the three questions that Candice hinted at in her introduction, which have become the three Hauser questions. The first one is, do we have these critical technologies ourselves? In which case we do, of course, everything is just fine. The second question then is, if we do not have all the critical technologies that are needed, then do we have access to them from multiple independent countries, so that no single country could hold us to ransom by withholding the technologies, by having a monopoly on it? And if the answer to that is no, do we have unfettered, long-term, more than 5 years, guaranteed access from a monopoly or oligopoly supplier of a single country, of course, typically China and the US? And if we do get three no's to these three questions, it's one of those cases where we have to do whatever it takes, because if you don't, then you become dependent on another state and you get exposed to this economic coercion. So I then started writing this book with my co-author Hazem Naqib, and we thought, as passionate Europeans, there were probably going to be three technology sovereignty circles, and our argument was going to be that if you're not within one of those three circles and you're a third country, then you have to choose between one of the three. And the argument was going to be choose Europe, because it's the only one that isn't the hegemon, because the US will ask the question, are you with us and are you against us? And if you say, no, I'm with you, then they'll say, well, now do exactly as I say. And the same thing is true for China with their Belt and Road Initiative. They have also a hegemonic approach to the relationship with other countries. But Europe is the only country that has a proven record of accepting national differences. And the reason why I know this is I spent my winters in New Zealand because my wife is a Kiwi and we've had a farm down there for 30 years. And I'm part of a team to restructure the innovation infrastructure for the New Zealand government. And the issue came up, could New Zealand join Horizon Europe? And the interesting, so I rang up, I said I didn't know, they asked me, and I rang up my friends in Brussels, and I got the following answer. And the answer was, well, New Zealand does not score very highly on geographic proximity, but this is not the question we ask. The question we ask is, do you share our values? And of course, neither New Zealand nor Australia or Canada have any problem with that because they all share European values. And all three countries now have made applications to become part of Horizon Europe, which is our 100 billion euro support infrastructure for technology. And New Zealand, I'm pleased to tell you, has now actually become part of Horizon Europe. So it's really, I'm very proud of Europe because it's the only area that has a working governance layer above the nation state, which sort of works. I mean, there are all kinds of criticisms that we have, and of course we want to make it work a lot better, but it has given us peace since the Second World War, and it has also created the second most important currency, the euro, in the world. So it's really the argument of the book was going to be it's the best choice for independent states. Starting with semiconductors, which I know a little bit about, it became clear that actually there will not be technology sovereignty circles in the sense that any of even the three big ones could do all the technologies that they need themselves. Because no country has all the components, and semiconductors is a good example. Because out of the three technology sovereignty circles that I talked about, the US, China, and Europe, none of them can produce the world's most advanced chips. There are only two factories in the world that can produce 5 nanometer and below chips, and they're TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in Korea. So this was a wake-up call that the technologies are actually much more widely spread across countries than we expected. Another example is that before a chip goes down on the iPhone circuit board somewhere in China or India or Vietnam, it actually crosses 40 country borders. So we have a hyper-connected industry in the semiconductor industry. And that's why Ursula von der Leyen changed Biden's rhetoric from decoupling to de-risking. So really the right interpretation of sovereignty is not one of autarky, not one of being able to produce everything yourself, but to make sure that you have independent access to all these technologies from multi-different sources so that you do not become dependent on a single country for any of them. There are, of course, a number of choke points. The US with EDA tools, Synopsys and Cadence have a duopoly on chip design. So this was, in fact, the choke point that Trump used to force ARM to do what he wanted. But Europe also has such a choke point, which, of course, we have never used, but we could in the future, and that is ASML. ASML is a lithography company that is the only company in the world that can produce the lithography machines for 5 nanometer chips and below. And Taiwan, of course, produces 80% of these, and Samsung, 80% of these advanced chips, and Samsung the rest. But watch China, because SMC is one of the fastest growing semiconductor companies in the world. So Europe in particular, of course, has to decide on whether it wants to be the backwards looking Europe, and you see our wonderful Colosseum in Rome here, or it wants to be a forward looking Europe, which is the NAP laboratory here in the Cambridge Science Park. The EEC plays this important role of supporting European high tech with 10 billion euros. And I'm very pleased to say that I helped write the rules. And one of the best rules was that the EIC can only invest if at least 50% of the money comes from the market. And that is worked a treat. So it's actually now 4 to 1. So every euro that we spend, 4 euros comes from the market. So the book that I'm writing is Technology Sovereignty for all the 8 billion people who live on Earth. And I took this expression from Jacinda Ardern, who put down the phenomenal success that New Zealand had in coping with the COVID crisis to the team of 5 million, the 5 million New Zealanders who all followed government orders, used the apps when they went to the restaurants, and just behaved incredibly well. And that's how New Zealand had a total of 200 deaths throughout the pandemic. It was just totally outstanding. Patents, of course, are extremely important, and China now is leading the patent situation ahead of the US. Semiconductors I have talked about, and of course ARM has become a dominant supplier of microprocessors in the world with almost 100% market share in mobile phones. The CHIPS Act in the US and in Europe and the sanctions that we have imposed against China have a number of unintended consequences that the politicians, I think, did not take into account. Because basically these sanctions force China to beat us. Now, why will they beat us? Well, because you need 3 things to succeed in the semiconductor industry. One is money, and China is outspending the US and Europe in putting money into semiconductors. 2 is a number of high-quality engineers, same thing. China produces more high-quality engineers than Europe and the US taken together, and of course they work harder. And the 3rd thing that you need, which is actually probably the most important, China is responsible for 70% of the chips market in the world. So they have a built-in market that they can sell to. Now, people were laughing when I made this statement and said, no, China won't have good semiconductors for another 20 or 30 years. And then Huawei's Kirin 9000 appeared last year, which is a 7-nanometer chip produced by SMIC, designed by Huawei without American help. And it's the chip in the M60 smartphone from Huawei, which is now outselling the iPhone in China. I won't go into the detail of ARM. I will just finish off by saying that one of the solutions of having a very widespread availability of critical technology is what has happened in open source software. So all the data center run Linux, which is an open source piece of software that's being used across the world, can be used by any country everywhere. And I think we're beginning to have a similar situation in hardware all over the world. I won't go into we can talk about AI in the discussion. It is the most important technology that we've ever come across. It really is, because it addresses productivity. And you don't need a PhD in economics to know that if you improve productivity, you make everybody better off. And we've got a very nice Cambridge company called Unlikely.ai, which gets rid of hallucinations and explainability. Quantum computing, I spend a lot of my time on. I've made 7 investments already. That's also one of those spectacular improvements in silicon performance that we're about to see. The architecture is wide open. That's why it's so exciting. But to conclude, in my opinion, there is no country that can have technology sovereignty exclusively in the sense of being able to do all the critical technologies themselves. European VC has come of age, and the EIC, I think, is a very helpful source of investment in European technology companies. These large language models, these latest AI breakthrough, are key to the improvement on productivity in the world. And I think I will stop there and open it up for our questions.
Hermann, thank you so much. You've touched on these points where we could spend hours discussing. I would like to, before we turn to Vrinda Kapoor, I would like to give our audience, all you need to do is to put your question in the chat, and it will be given to us and to Dr. Hauser. I would like to turn over to my co-moderator, Dora Petrani. I know that she has some questions to ask you.
Well, thank you very much. This was really fascinating, and there are lots of questions that I have at the moment. The first and foremost, you mentioned critical data sets and critical technology. And I think the biggest question that from a legal or regulatory perspective one can ask is how and who does define what is critical when it comes to sovereignty? So how do you see critical, how critical is critical, and how critical is critical's definition?
Yes, this is a vexing question. And we now have a number of committees around Europe, in the UK, but also in Europe, creating a list of critical technologies so that everybody knows what is really critical, because this is, of course, agree on, because everybody has to agree on what is critical and what isn't. Otherwise, we can't, we can't make decisions.
Thank you. Then my second question is more of a comment on the regulator's responsibility. And you said at some point that there is a risk for Europe to be lagging behind in this race between the US, China, and Europe. I very much share this view, and I see a big role for regulators to define what are the boundaries when technology sovereignty becomes a protectionism rather than something which prevents from extortion. So there is always a very fine line here. You mentioned the European AI Act as an example, and I couldn't agree more. And there is a lot to be seen later, whether it becomes a model regulation similar to GDPR, or whether this becomes really one of the hurdles for European companies to compete with the West or the East, if you'd like. When it comes to regulating data and technology sovereignty, though, to me, always the key question is when you regulate, and there are also European countries who regulate this, whether you regulate it in a protectionist way, you want to keep all your data in-house, but at the same time, you make sure that this is part of a global or at least European network when it comes to Europe, or whether you create such a safe haven which is no longer communicating with the outside world. Do you see a way when regulation can help in finding the right balance in providing for sovereignty and preventing from extortion, but at the same time, as many governments also within Europe say that, like, for example, health data, governmental data, defense-related data should stay within the country. Do you still see that we can talk about country-based regulation in the current era of technological advancement? For me, it's very difficult to see that maybe you can shed a light on that.
Well, this is a particularly hot discussion with respect to AI, because people agree, and even the some of the leaders in AI technology agree that we need regulation. Now, if you believe, as I do, and there is a lot of evidence now that AI technologies can influence productivity directly in many of our portfolio companies, we see productivity increases of 30% or so on the sales facing side, on the marketing side, and productivity increases of 70 to 100% when it comes to programming. So since programming itself is very catalytic in the economy, you basically have a catalyst of a catalyst. So you really have a very significant influence on productivity in a nation, depending on whether they are rolling out AI techniques or not. So if you believe this connection between AI and productivity, if Europe is too restrictive in the use of AI and America and China is not, then you give them a great advantage of getting ahead, having higher growth rates, higher GDP, and we fall behind. So in my opinion, regulation of AI needs to be international. It needs to be a coordination of all the major countries. I think all the countries do actually agree that we need regulation. I don't think there is a disagreement. Of course, the devil is in the detail here on how we regulate AI so that it doesn't fall foul of the problems that you outlined, Dora, of being so restrictive that you disadvantage the companies in under your jurisdiction. So it's got to be international regulation.
Thank you very much. I'm handing back now for now to Candice, but thank you very much for these answers.
Thank you, Dora, for the excellent questions, and Hermann for the wonderful answers. I think we would like to go to our expert commentator, but before we do that, I do not want to miss the opportunity to have you speak a little bit more, Hermann. You just whetted our appetite about quantum, quantum technology, and in particular, I would like to understand your thoughts about how ready the technology is to be commercialized.
Yes, so I spend a lot of my time in quantum computing now. I've made 7 investments already, and the excitement about quantum computing really lies in the long-term applications. And in my opinion, the most important long-term application is actually simulating molecules because they are quantum systems. And Richard Feynman famously said, why would you use a classical computer to simulate a quantum system? You really ought to use a quantum computer to simulate a quantum system. And the reason why this is so important is, of course, that the way that drug molecules bind into protein is the way that the pharma industry works. So if quantum computers could solve this ligation problem, long term, you can think about doing drug trials in silico, which would revolutionize the way the pharma industry works. But this is quite a few years out. Closer in, we've got the problem that quantum computers are known to be able to crack RSA 2048, which is our main encryption standard. So the way all the banks talk to each other, if you have any encrypted channel on WhatsApp or any of the encrypted channel, they all use RSA 2048. And the most famous algorithm in quantum computing is called Shor's algorithm. And Shor's algorithm has proven that a quantum computer is actually powerful enough to crack these codes that were devised to be uncrackable, or you would need 10,000 years of our biggest classical computers. And by the time 10,000 years is passed, people wouldn't worry so much about having your code cracked. So this is, and interestingly, to give you a more precise answer to your question, there is a yearly opinion poll amongst all the leading quantum computer experts to guess as to when we'll have such an RSA cracker. And the answer is roughly in 10 years' time. So this gives you some indication of how far away we are.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm still investing in quantum though now. So Hermann, you talked about AI, you talked about chips, you talked about synthetic biology. So our expert commentator has created and has a wonderful AI company in India, 114AI. She is building India's first indigenous semiconductor company, Third Eye Tech, and her training is as a biologist. So I don't think we could have gotten, and she does happen to, of course, to be a member of the GTWN International Board, as is Dora. So I don't think we could have gotten a better expert commentator to, to perhaps also, ask some controversial questions to you, but also to share with us, how she is contributing to India's technology sovereignty. It was interesting, Hermann, that, India did not appear in either of the US, China, or, or Europe. So, which of course is a new phenomenon. So Rinda, over to you, please.
Thank you, Candice, and Mr. Hauser. It's a very hard act to follow, with giving all of your expertise in all of these sectors. But I'll try and do my best on that. Candice, I think you asked a very interesting question, which is India's new role in the technology or in the geopolitics of technology. And I think for that we have to step back a moment and think about China. For India, the concept of technology sovereignty or the advent of technology sovereignty is coming from two main places. Obviously, the growth of China in the last 2 decades, and then having faced Western sanctions, right? And what we've dealt with from a technology denial perspective. So I'll start with the first. I think the way China has built out its technology is interesting on 2 fronts. I'll talk about the specifics and then I'll talk about an anecdote. The first was the rise of the civil-military technology complex. They came up with this concept of indigenous innovation or independent innovation. And I think this has been a hallmark of President Xi's entire, his rule. They've been emphasizing the concept of self-reliance in industry and technology. We saw that even a decade before their 14th 5-year plan, which was released in March of 2021. And they talked about the CCP's future and its bets on technology for both economic reasons, but also diplomatic and political reasons. And I think this heralds me back to one specific speech where she was talking to the Communist Party's top theory journal, where they talked about the term, which I cannot pronounce, but it's acronymized as ZZCX, which means literally independent innovation. And he talked about that as a concept for the first time. It's not just a matter of national security, but it goes back to a concept of national pride. And I think that's where it becomes interesting, because India is one of the countries that shares the longest border with China in one of the most contested environments on this planet, 4,500 meters above sea level. And we have to defend that territory because there's a lot of territorial disputes there. Now, when we think about the US and how it's played a role, the US has only woken up to this, or at least the external messaging on China's growth in technology dominance has only become a point since a few years before the COVID pandemic. But what we started to see a very long time ago was China using military modernization to grow science and technology businesses. Started to see this around the early 2000s. I mean, there is a Stanford University paper from 2016, which talks about how China is using civil military fusion to build up its semiconductor capability. And that's an interesting thing that we've been watching for the last decade. The second, and I promised an anecdote, was my CTO spent his PhD, postdoc, and master's years at IMEC. And he shared a desk with a Chinese student. When they graduated from their postdoc, the Chinese student went back to China. He became a full professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, was given multi-million dollars in grants, founded a company called G-Pixel, and went out and acquired large teams of semiconductor experts in Europe. Took them back to China, trained an entire generation of technologists. And now we see them dominating silicon semiconductor design and imaging. So this is not something that has come up from a 4-year or 5-year plan. This has been something that has been going on for the last 20 years in terms of generational thinking. Now, there's a third dimension to this. And at one point in the war in Ukraine, the semiconductor sanctions that were being placed on Russia's access to semiconductor technology was actually creating an impact. And then we're starting to see reports of how the US is now having to sanction Chinese companies that are supplying semiconductors to the Russian war efforts in Ukraine. So that tells us a bit about how the civil military fusion is really been the way that a lot of countries are starting to build up their capability in critical technology. And that's not something that we can ignore. The second is from India's perspective. India has grown up in an entire era of technology denial. So from the 11th of May, 1998, when India conducted the first nuclear tests, we faced sanctions. And the sanctions meant that overnight, our entire Air Force was grounded because we didn't produce equipment for parachutes, for example. And that hit India very hard. That concept of technology denial, where all assistance to India except humanitarian aid were cut off. Since 2019, there has been a mean role reversal in that position, where the Modi government is placing a huge amount of emphasis on the development of critical technology, on the development of, and using military modernization to grow an entire generation of critical technology companies. We have an Indian semiconductor mission, akin to the US CHIPS Act. We have a national AI mission. The Ministry of Defense, for the first time in India, has an entire practice stood up on startups. We also have a National Deep Technology Fund, which is going to be notified in the budget next week. And what we're seeing is that more and more, there is an increased emphasis on investing in capability. India joins the technology scene. We call this India 1.0, where a lot of massive, gigantic companies were stood up to build, leveraging a labor arbitrage to build software giants. India 2.0, which is the current frame that we're in right now, has done exceedingly well building service apps for the consumer economy. But we are seeing the beginning of India 3.0 from the Indian Semiconductor Mission, as I just mentioned, and the National Deep Technology Fund. We're going to start seeing more and more critical technology companies coming out of India. More than anything, I think the hallmark of the current administration in India is that technology is becoming the ultimate diplomatic currency. But we're also seeing a very interesting route that the Indian government has taken on technology diplomacy. For example, between the US and India, we have this initiative on critical and emerging technology that is spearheaded by both national security advisors. Similarly, we just signed a joint agreement with South Korea and with Europe. So what we're starting to see is that India is looking for collaboration with allies who share a lot of the same values, as Mr. Hauser mentioned, on how do we create this ecosystem of shared technology and how do we prosper in it together. I think another very interesting theme that Mr. Hauser pulled on was this concept of deglobalization and technology and how it's actually becoming a huge amount, it's providing a huge opportunity for new entrepreneurs. I would actually be bold enough to call it fueling an industrial renaissance. With the escalating global geopolitical tensions, it is not a choice anymore, but it is not just a thematic feature anymore, but we're seeing a critical strategic shift away from globalization. And every country is feeling the pressure to fuel a domestic industrial renaissance. Nations are rethinking friends, dependencies, enemies. And it's causing this entire cascade of legislative initiatives to bolster a domestic ecosystem. The CHIPS Act in the US is a great example of it. Infrastructure investment is another part of it. I think we're also seeing the resurgence of a job dominance in election issues, which is fueling it even further. It's an interesting time and space for politics and for geopolitics, but it's also an interesting time for entrepreneurs. It's also very interesting for capital allocators because there's a unique wave of opportunities that are coming from reshoring. Against a backdrop of billions of dollars of non-dilutive government funding and the resulting tailwinds to reshore critical industry, companies that are able to strategically tap into those different pools of capital, debt, equity, and government funding may represent some of the biggest winners of our times. And the last point that I'd like to make is, it's a very interesting article that I read about a year ago. It was written by Trey Stephens and Marky Wagner. It talks mostly about Sturgeon's law, that 90% of everything is nonsense. And the title of the article shook me up. It says that Silicon Valley and the technology ecosystem in general are facing a crisis of nonsense. The world's best, brightest, and most money, with the rare potential to take on and deliver moonshots, have largely abdicated their responsibility, constituting a failure of progress and a moral failure. It talks about how, the dawn of the 20th century was so much innovation into hard quests, and they define hard quests as problems that are difficult to solve, difficult to raise money for, and difficult to create business plans out of. So, in the 20th century, we saw the development of the first controlled airplane. Half a century later, a man was on the moon for the first time. Combustion, penicillin, nuclear fission, quantum computing. The history is defined by protagonists pursuing these good quests. The technologies we're talking about right now, which are creating geopolitical shifts across the world, quantum technologies, semiconductors, AI, are those good quests. In the backdrop of all of these geopolitical tensions, we're also going to see opportunities. One, for companies to grow and prosper, but also for some unusual friendships to get created. We're seeing those unusual friendships get created on the other side. I think it's now up to the allies, as I would like to call it, to shake out archaic and Cold War era rules, which are designed to protect and say no, and think about how we can coordinate and collaborate so that we actually reap benefits of this in the next decade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vrinda. I love the good quests. This is something I think that we can all work on. I would like to invite Hermann and Dora to come back on screen. I have two suggestions. We also have a question from the audience, which I think is very, very interesting, which is basically the ownership of data to train models on and who decides. And but before we do that, I would like to ask Hermann to ask one question to Vrinda on what she has talked about. And Vrinda, I would like you to ask one question to Hermann on what he has talked about, and really just maybe 3 minutes for the question and answer, and over to you, Hermann.
Well, thank you, Brenda, for a wonderful description of what's happening in India. There is a wonderful book by Piketty about how nations grow over decades and centuries, and what he claims is that at the end, nations go through these sigmoid growth curves, and then they plateau out roughly at where we are in the West at the moment. And China now shows higher growth rates than, India now shows higher growth rates than China, and China is beginning to get close to the to slowing down again. So I wonder if you could make some comments of where India is, because in many ways, India, of course, if one just looks at the size of the population, which has now overtaken China, could potentially become the largest economy in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Hauser, and I think that's a really interesting question. So there's two parts about India. One is, of course, the size and the scale of this country. And I was recently, working with the government on a project where I, for the first time, was confronted with not just the size and scale, but the diversity of the issues that we face in this country. And from the smallest of constituencies all the way up to large cities, the issues are enormous and they're wide-ranging. So it's quite an administrative powerhouse that we have over here. But what's been very interesting to me has been the use of technology in solving a lot of these problems. As an example, India has recently come out with its own version of a GPS chip, which coordinates with the Indian satellites. And one of the main objectives was to help stranded fishermen and be able to bring them back to shore. Right? Since we don't have industrialized shipping, it was about bringing them back to shore so that they wouldn't just die out there and they would have a way to send an SOS rescue signal. There was a time when population was considered one of India's biggest strengths because we were moving into that part of the journey where we were getting into a manufacturing economy. So having large number of labor was actually extremely important from the 90s to the early 2000s in transforming the Indian economy. I think the issue that is now up to the Indian government to solve is how we take this extremely large population and we make them employable for the transition in the ecosystem that we're seeing. So the government is putting a lot of emphasis behind technology, behind electronics, behind AI, quantum, deep technology. The question is, how do you make the population educationally ready to be able to be employed and how you carry them along with this way? That's going to really tell us how this S-curve grows out in India. I think the Chinese government had a very interesting solution to that, which may not be directly applicable to India. So I think the question for policymakers is going to be that fiscal deficit that we don't want to see come out of that growth in the country, how we can ramp that up in the next couple of years.
You're on mute, Candice.
Candice, I think you're on mute.
Yes. Thank you, Vrinda. You did have the opportunity to comment on what Dr. Hauser had said. So unless there's something else that you would like to ask, I think we might want to go to our question from the audience. So in introducing this question, I have to also share that recently I was in the United States and I was very concerned, and I came back and I said, wow, instead of sharing data, instead of making certain that our systems where we are, which we are building amongst the allies are interoperable, we are setting up barriers. And I am so worried about this. And so if you tie this together, now, with this question, who owns the data to train the models? How do we, who decides? How do we share data? And, I think that I would just ask Dr. Hauser if you could, give your thoughts about this, and then Dora, because I know this is a very big point for you, and then Vrinda. But Hermann, over to you.
Right. Well, there are two big trends in AI. One is clearly the old saying "garbage in, garbage out" is also true for AI. If you have the wrong data sets, you will produce large language models that are not very good at all and full of hallucinations. One of the great trends in AI is actually for smaller models, but smaller models that are based on highly curated, high quality data sets. So this, of course, is particularly true for healthcare, where, and Dora will probably make some interesting comment on that, where both the benefits and the dangers are both extreme. Because on one hand, of course, you do not want to open up the details of somebody's condition, health, physical or mental conditions to everybody who wants to go to the database and find out about it. On the other hand, we can anonymize these data, and the benefits of having high quality data to train the models and understand what causes these diseases is highly desirable. So Dora might have some wisdom on that one.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think it's a great question and a very fundamental question to the future of technologies and also the future opportunities that arise with the new technologies such as AI, especially generative AI. The pandemic was a fantastic example, I believe, on what data, a proper data governance and sharing data could provide as a benefit for everyone in the globe. Because had you have the traditional interpretation of sensitive data under privacy regulations and healthcare regulations and data protection, not only in the sense of privacy, but also in the sense of healthcare information with respect to a certain country, the amount of research and the acceleration of the research and the fact that these data could be shared was something which was quite a new phenomenon, and that led to the fast reaction to the pandemic back then. So I do believe we have now a very plausible example on how proper data governance actually can help foster progress in technology and future benefits for everyone. On who owns the data, I think the bigger question is that who is to say what data to use? And here is where I see that governments do have a role to allow sharing of data. And in Europe, the data, I should mention that it's not only the EU AI Act, but also the Data Act is a significant step forward in this respect, which helps fostering the sharing of non-privacy, non-individual data with respect to fostering future economic growth into Europe and hopefully beyond. And then the bigger question is that who owns the outputs of AI generated content, whether it's copyright, whether it's invention. So who owns these outputs, and whether there should be an individual or an individual entity to be awarded these outputs, or is it part of the greater good or the community? And there are some early jurisprudence on it. I don't think there is like a final say. As a good lawyer, you always say it depends, but this will be probably the most exciting question going forward for lawyers. I would like to just maybe finish with one point that we spoke a lot about data, and I'm so glad that Dr. Hauser, you mentioned that it's not all about the large language models and the large amount of data sets that AI can use. I do think that AI in general has a transformative change to many industries and sectors, also in a smaller data set or in a smaller way, if you'd like. And here, the EU AI Act, one of the key mentions, I believe, is that it puts an obligation not only on producers, but also on deployers on AI literacy. And that goes back to Vrinda's point on why it's so important that everyone understands what they are working with, the risks, that it might hallucinate, what can it cause to you, and how to use it to maximize the impact. So literacy and education will be key, I believe. Thank you very much, Candace, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dora. And we have 3 minutes to go. Vrinda, if you can just chime in here for 1 minute, and we do have another question.
I think the points that Dora made were really exactly the point, but I would like to add one thing, and that is that I think the problem is that technology is evolving at such a rapid rate that policy is trailing. And I think that the only real solution to that is to bring in more technocrats into government to help in formulation of these policies. We also have to identify that these policies will never be static. Right? They have to keep evolving, which means that we need to have discussions in real time and keep moving the agenda forward. What we don't want is it's an era where technology is so restricted by policy that we lose the ability to actually gain traction out of it, and we end up with just, you know, the hype and the garbage that's there in the open source. Thank you.
So excellent discussion. We've received a question from Myla Villanueva, and Myla Villanueva is our GTWN president of Asia Pacific. She was also the one who alerted us to the geopolitical use of technology as coercion, Hermann. And so I wanted to make certain and pay homage to Myla. Myla's question is, you know, what about space defense technologies? Who is ahead? Space wars. And she says, maybe for the next webinar. And that is true. But one that I would say, Myla, if I can take this question a little bit in the last minute, is that, you know, beforehand we had the war, the space race against Russia and the United States. That is no longer the case. We have China, we have North Korea, we have Iran, and we also have, and this kind of goes to the point of Dora, we also have what I call emerging spacefaring nations. And I am fighting to make certain that there is enough bandwidth, enough orbital frequencies, etc., to be able for the new spacefaring emerging nations to also contribute ways that we have never ever thought about, because they have certain needs that space can, you know, can take care of, be it civil, be it defense. So watch this space. Thank you all so very much, Dr. Hauser, Brenda Kapoor, Dora Petrani. Thank you, dear audience, for tuning in once again to the GTWN CMS webinar, the Mobile Century series. We look forward to welcoming you soon and wish you all a nice day, a nice afternoon, a nice evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.